Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 221. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Georgia. No, not that Georgia, the Republic of Georgia.
See one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I have one bit of groveling to do and then a couple news stories. First, the groveling. If you're listening to this show on or before March 1st, 2010, then I could really use a favor. I could use a vote in a contest that Nomadic Matt is doing that could send me to Costa Rica. You don't even have to give your email address, so you won't get spammed from this. You just have to go to amateurtraveler.com/vote, and that will send you to the place where you can vote for the Amateur Traveler and hopefully send me to Costa Rica. If you're listening to this after March 1st, still go to that same URL. I'll redirect it to something else useful or interesting or helpful. Now, in news stories, I had an odd one, and this one again is relatively close to home, and this is an interesting debate for you. Some of you know that I sent out an email to people who I've exchanged email with to try and encourage people to join the Amateur Traveler newsletter, amateurtraveler.com/newsletter. And I'm giving away a free ebook, as I've mentioned on the show before, How to Save Money While You Book Travel Online. Well, I received an interesting email, and this email is on the blog for the Amateur Traveler in its entirety, basically calling me a liar because I said that you could save money by booking travel online. Because this was written by someone who is a travel agent and is of the opinion that you can only or should only book travel through a travel agent. Now, I'm curious. We've had at least a couple of people who've talked about their experiences, certainly positive experiences working with travel agents where they certainly save time and sometimes possibly save money. We've had a couple who talked about nightmarish experiences. So what are your experiences? I'll put a link in the show notes to this show to that blog post that basically says, should you use a travel agent? And I'd be curious to hear what your experiences are using travel agents and how that has worked out for you. Two travel news stories. One is that Nippon Airways is going to be offering women-only restrooms, women-only toilets on their flights. Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Men will be able to use them in case of emergency or if they're on a flight that doesn't have enough women, but they're basically prioritizing giving women an extra restroom. Curious. And then the second one, which is much less debatable, I think I'm less inclined to fly Spirit Airlines after reading this story. Spirit Airlines had a passenger apparently on a layover who was a doctor who was asking for a glass of water for his very pregnant wife. Apparently he asked multiple times over a 2-hour period. They did not give him or her the water. They did get so annoyed they kicked them both off the plane. Something to think about next time you're planning on which airline you're going to travel on. I'll put links to all those news items as well as to This Week in Travel. Well, we'll talk about some of those in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Kathy from My Time to Travel, who is currently from North Carolina, although I suspect she may not be originally from there, come to talk to us about Georgia. Kathy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
And when I say Georgia, we're not talking about the state. We're talking about the country. And the way we distinguish that is, you said we call it the Republic of Georgia.
Well, Republic of Georgia, yes, or Country of Georgia would do. Either way, you have to be really careful when you're trying to Google it because you tend to wind up with the state.
Exactly. So why did you end up in Georgia? Not a popular destination.
Well, a couple of reasons. The first is mountains. Some people are beach people, some people are city people. I really like mountains. Not so much to slide down them or to climb up them, but I really like them as part of the scenery, and I like to go hiking. And the Caucasus had been kind of on my radar screen for a while. Then the other reason is the Silk Road. Back in 2001, I traveled the Silk Road from Beijing to Islamabad. And ever since, it was a fabulous trip. And the Karakoram Highway from Kashgar into Pakistan is just incredible.
And in case we have anybody who doesn't know what the Silk Road is, could you give us a little historical background there?
Yes, the Silk Road really isn't just one route. It's a skein. You could think of it as a skein stretching from China, maybe all the way to Venice.
Uh-huh.
And at various times it's had various different routes. And it was never really a route that one merchant would go all the way from China to Venice. He would hand off to people along the way. I did the part going into Pakistan, but then it would often go through Afghanistan, it would go into Iran. We tend to think of the Silk Road mostly during the Mongol Empire, when the Mongols ruled almost the entire route, and it was peaceful. But Georgia, in fact, prior to that iteration of the Silk Road, was actually trading with India much earlier than that. It wasn't so much part of the Silk Road during the Mongol period, but it had trading links with Asia earlier than that. But the really core part of the Silk Road is, of course, Central Asia, with the 5 stands. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, which is where I would really like to get to. And it just seemed again that last year was not the year I was going to get to Central Asia. So I thought I would go visit the western end of the Silk Road. And that was another reason why originally I was going to do Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. But I waited until after the Iranian elections to apply for a visa for Iran.
Okay.
And everything I was reading said that I was not going to get a visa for Iran for either my UK or my US passport.
Okay.
So I wound up going to Georgia, Armenia, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, because Aleppo and Damascus, for instance, were definitely trading posts on the Silk Road.
Right, in Syria. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the highlights of Georgia? What really stands out for you?
Oh, of course, the mountains.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I didn't get up into the higher Caucasus, which is what I was really intending to do. I wound up with a medical problem. I had a problem with my left eye, and the ophthalmologist told me I should not go up to Kazbegi in the higher Caucasus because of the pressure changes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it was not something I had heard of before. But so I went to the Lesser Caucasus in the south instead. So definitely mountains. You're right that not a lot of people are going to Georgia right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a great destination if you want to get off the main tourist trail. I saw one tour group in the 2 weeks I was there, and I think that was an Israeli tour group. There are quite a lot of Israelis traveling in Georgia. There's a direct flight from Tel Aviv to Tibilisi.
Interesting.
And a scattering of European backpackers. But if you want to get off the beaten path, certainly in September, it's a good time to go. The weather was not very good for me. I kept hearing that they had a bad summer that year, but certainly it was a little on the cold and damp side for me.
Now, Georgia had a little problems with stability recently and some of the relations to Russia. That you didn't feel that was something that was impacting your trip?
Not last year. I mean, clearly, the year before, you definitely didn't want to be there.
Right.
And I know a couple of people who I'd read about whose trips, and they just had to completely change them because of the South Ossetia situation. But it looked to me last year that Russia was more interested in Ukraine last year than it was in Georgia.
Okay. All right.
I have checked some of the tour companies that you would expect to be running tours to Georgia, and one or two of them are running tours this year, but only like maybe a couple of tours for the whole year.
Okay. And what itinerary would you recommend for someone who was going to follow in your footsteps and go to Georgia?
Well, the itinerary as I originally planned it, I flew into Batumi on the Black Sea coast. There's a direct flight from Istanbul on Turkish Airlines. Then I went overland to Kutash, which is the second city after Tibilisi, and onto Tibilisi, and then I was going to go up the Georgian military highway to Kazbegi, which is up in the high mountains. The photograph on the front of the Lonely Planet guide, which is a church on a hill with a mountain behind it, is kind of the standard photograph for Georgia, and that's at Kazbegi. And then I was going to go to the wine district in Kakheti, which is east of Tibilisi. And I wound up not going up to Kazbegi and going south to Borjomi in the southern mountains instead. But if I was going to do it over, I would make a change to that. Reading Lonely Planet, it sounded like going up to the mountains other than to Kazbegi would be a little difficult. You can't really go up to the mountains in the west and then cross the mountains to the east unless you're going to want to trek, multiple day treks. If you want to go up by four-wheel transport, you can go up to Svaneti in the west, Kazbegi in the center, and Tusheti in the east, but you have to come back down and then go up again. And it sounded like getting to Svaneti and Tusheti was going to be a little difficult. But the people I talked to while I was in Georgia, it sounded like really it was not that hard, that you could get transport up there quite easily. So I would probably plan to do at least 2, if not 3 of the places up into the higher Caucasus.
Okay. And the higher Caucasus are the range of mountains that's running along the northern border of the country?
Right, the border with Russia.
Okay.
Or the border with the Muslim autonomous republics that are just over the Georgian border. That's
okay.
Where you're going to find places like Chechnya,
right,
Dagestan, North Ossetia. And of course, I mean, the situation is still unstable with Russia over South Ossetia and also Abkhazia, which is over in the far west.
Okay.
Which is really unfortunate for Georgia because that used to be really the Black Sea coast. And I went to Batumi on the Black Sea coast, but I think the resorts really were in Abkhazia, which is now looks like it's going to be reabsorbed by Russia.
Huh.
And I can't really recommend Batumi as a beach destination. It reminded me a lot of the English beaches from my childhood, and that is not a good thing.
And when you say that, in what way?
Well, pebbles.
Pebbles, okay.
And cold grey water, okay. And people sitting around with their clothes on. When I was a child, I used to go to the beach and plan that you might need a windbreak. In September, I was thinking it's only just the off-season, but it really felt much more off-season than that. And I had been in the Crimea Black Sea coast in the off-season, and it was much livelier than Batumi was. I actually ran into 3 British backpackers who had spent 19 hours in Batumi and left. I think they were looking for nightlife and they didn't find any. I wasn't actually looking for nightlife, but I could see where there might have been some at some time, but there certainly wasn't anything to speak of when I was there.
Okay.
I did go to the Romano-Byzantine fort to the south of Batumi, which was quite interesting, and they have really good botanical gardens to the north, but I can't really recommend it as a beach destination.
Okay.
And the other thing I should say, I think, is that Georgia is a great destination if you want to get off the beaten path. It's also a great budget destination, but it's probably not a great destination if you're looking for luxury.
Okay, I would assume that.
There are 2 Marriotts and a Radisson in Tibilisi, and I checked. For May this year, the main Marriott is charging $265 a night, which is amazing. And Sheraton is building a hotel in Tibilisi and a hotel in Batumi. But aside from that, there's one local chain called Riccioli, which I think is probably fairly comfortable. And in Tibilisi, there are a number of kind of mid-range hotels. But if up in the mountains, there's really not much in the way of hotels. And you're mostly looking at homestays.
Okay.
And I kind of did a mix. I did a couple of homestays, the B&B, a couple of lower-end hotels, and one upper mid-range hotel in Tibilisi. And if you're doing homestays, they basically run about 25 lari a night for bed and breakfast, which is about $14.
Okay.
And in Tibilisi, I was paying, about 90 lari, which is about $50, for a comfortable hotel, an ensuite room, air conditioning, heat, but nothing at all luxurious. And then for transport, you're really looking at buses or marshrutkas. A marshrutka is kind of an overgrown minivan.
Okay.
It's
I think we talked about that for the Armenia episode, as I recall. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you probably did. There are local ones that run around town, and then there's the long-distance ones between cities. And if you don't want to travel in those, you're looking at a car and driver, which is easy enough to arrange, but isn't really that cheap.
Okay.
So if you were going to do a more high-end trip, what you'd probably do is fly into Tibilisi, stay in the Marriott, and arrange a car and driver for day trips, which would get you some distance up the Georgian military highway into the mountains, but wouldn't give you an overnight. It did look to me like some of the wineries in the wine district were starting to put in places to stay, and that might also be a possibility.
And where's the wine district again?
The wine district is east of Tibilisi.
Okay.
It's called Kakheti. And I stayed in a place called Telavi, which was definitely not really tourist central. There is another town called Signagi, which the tourist development people in Georgia are kind of developing to be a tourist area. But I don't really like places like that.
Okay.
Like Old Town Tibilisi, which Lonely Planet waxes lyrical about, has a couple of streets that are clearly tourist central that have been done over with shops and cafes, but it's very clearly been done over for tourists.
All right.
The rest of the old town is pretty decrepit, actually. There are some really nicely renovated buildings, and the expensive hotel I stayed in was one of them, but a lot of it's pretty run down.
Okay. Other than decrepit hotels, what else would draw one to Georgia?
Well, churches. We haven't talked about the churches.
Okay.
Very distinctive church architecture. I have this theory that you can tell what country you're in by looking at the churches, and that's very much the case in Georgia. They're cruciform, built in a cross shape, often with another building between the arms of the cross, and then with a central circular or polygonal tower with long, thin windows and kind of a dunce's cap top on top of the tower. And they tend to be built in places that are difficult to get to. I mean, it looks like they were built as much for defense as for religion.
Okay.
And they tend to be frescoed, and there tends to be some rather nice carving on them. Not quite up to the level of the Kachkars in Armenia, which are just spectacular, but still pretty good stone carving. Unfortunately, the Russians did a very bad job of looking after them. In fact, they did the opposite of looking after them, and some of them are in pretty bad shape. And there seems to be a lot of renovation going on right now. And there's also a brand new cathedral in Tibilisi. It's huge. It looms over the whole city on a hill on one side of the river that runs through the capital. And that has Georgian religious architecture and iconography reinterpreted in a sense. It has new icons, new carving, and it's really quite interesting to look at.
And these are Orthodox, I'm assuming. Are they Russian Orthodox, or is there a Georgian?
Georgian. They're Georgian Orthodox.
Okay.
Yeah, Georgia was the second country to become Christian after Armenia.
Oh, okay. I knew Armenia. I did not know Georgia was second.
Yeah, it was like maybe 25, 30 years afterwards. It was pretty soon after.
Interesting.
And it managed to stay Christian despite
So we're talking
waves.
roughly the 300s.
Yeah, 300s, 400s, I think. Lonely Planet doesn't give me the date. Maybe Brat does. I bought Lonely Planet and the Brat Guide, but I found Lonely Planet was much more useful to travel with.
And why is that?
Well, Brat is great if you want to drive yourself to every church in the country. But I was not planning to drive myself, and I did not want to visit every church in the country. I just found Lonely Planet much more useful for logistics and it was easier to use their hotel listings as well. Brat just seemed to list every possible place to stay without a whole lot of information about them, whereas Lonely Planet will at least tell you, whether this is a budget place, whether this is a mid-range place, whether the hot water works. And actually, you need to have some concern about the water and the electricity in Georgia.
Meaning that they don't always work on a reliable fashion.
Right, especially the electricity. I was traveling with a Nokia N800 internet tablet,
Yep.
and there were several places where I could run my hairdryer, but I couldn't charge the batteries for the Nokia.
Huh.
There was power, but there just wasn't enough power for that. And then in Batumi, the streets in Batumi were in really bad shape. I mean, I never thought I would say this, but they were actually worse than the streets in Moldova, which I thought was about as bad as it got for Europe. Partly that was because they were putting in water pipes.
Oh, okay.
Which were clearly needed because several of the houses had water tanks on the roof. It wasn't the only reason they were bad, though. It was clear this was like the third, fourth, fifth time this particular street had been dug up. And they had something I had never seen before. These were these kind of curved pieces of metal that went from the curb over the gutter to the road. So you could step over the gutter on this piece of metal. So clearly they expected a lot of water to run down the street.
Okay.
And Batumi is in a temperate rainforest. And, of course, you can't have a rainforest without rain.
Right. Well, we don't need to worry about the date there. I'm just finding 4th century.
Yeah. And there are actually churches going back almost that far. There are one or two really very old churches in Georgia. So you've got everything from the old ones, some from what was Georgia's golden age in the 11th, 12th century, and then this really new cathedral in Tibilisi. Georgia has had a very unfortunate history in a sense. And the Caucasus region is kind of a crossroads.
Right.
Which is not a good thing if you happen to live there because you have all these waves of invaders and empires coming through and taking over. And just about every local empire has taken it over at one time or another.
What was the biggest surprise for you in Georgia?
I think, one of the biggest surprises was realizing just how far back the history went in this area.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I hadn't really thought about it before, but it looks like it was one of the very first places when we came out of Africa. Depending on who you read, there were people living in this area 100,000 or 200,000 years ago.
Oh, my.
And you'll find those flint and obsidian arrowheads in the museum dating back to the Mesolithic. And then there was this rather good period with the Greek colonists when it was Colchis. I don't know if you remember the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the
Sure.
Golden Fleece.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, that was Colchis, and that was western Georgia. In fact, in the central government district in Batumi, there's this really tall column with the statue of Medea holding the Golden Fleece on top of it.
Huh. Interesting.
So, yeah, lots and lots of history. And it's interesting that they were also in the first wave of the Islamic invasions. So the Arabs showed up in the 600s, but it remained Christian. And it remained Christian even though for several hundred years, part of it was occupied by the Persians and part of it was occupied by the Ottomans. And then, of course, you had the Russians.
Right.
Who, first of all, under the Tsars, it would have been Russian Orthodox, and then under the Soviets, it would have been atheism.
Sure.
They definitely seem to have retained Georgian Christianity. And I did notice in the churches that people would come in and light candles in front of the icons. I had somebody from my hotel drive me up to Anandpuri on the Georgian Military Highway, which was as far as it seemed like I was going to get. And I noticed that he lit candles for all the icons in the churches there. And in the big cathedral in Tibilisi, there were quite a lot of people in there. Although I did notice there's one young man kind of off by himself, on his knees, but talking on his cell phone.
Well, he may have a more direct line. That's really as long as you know the number, I suppose.
Yeah. I also found that people were very welcoming. In fact, I had an unusual experience at Batumi airport. And I flew in from Istanbul. A lot of people on the plane, but I think most of them may have been going to Hopi in eastern Turkey. What Turkish Airlines does with that flight is it flies into Batumi, and then they'll bus people going to Hopi back over the border into Turkey. So I think I was the second person in line for passport control, and the young guy stamps my passport, and he gives it back to me with this absolutely beaming smile and a hearty welcome to Georgia. And you kind of have the feeling at that point, maybe he doesn't see too many tourists here.
What was the best day you had in Georgia?
Best day I had probably in Tel Aviv, in the wine district. I wound up sharing a car and driver with an Israeli couple who were staying in the same homestay I was. And we did 2 or 3 monasteries and a couple of wineries. And we had lunch in this absolute hole-in-the-wall place in this little village somewhere, the point where we got hungry. And we actually wound up riding up to one of the churches. It's about 1.5 kilometers off the main road, and it was being renovated. And the people renovating it were hauling dirt up in this Soviet-era truck and gave us a ride up to the monastery in the truck, and it was one of these, switchback roads where you have to back up in order to get around the corner. And a great view when you get up the top. And, of course, I always love going to wineries. The Georgian wine industry has a reputation for making sweet wine, but that was for the Russian taste. And
okay.
Russia is not importing anything from Georgia anymore. It isn't importing wine. It isn't importing mineral water from Batumi. And my understanding is the border's still closed. So now they're trying to make wine more for Western palates. And the whites didn't seem to do much for me, but the Saperavi grapes that they're making red from were not bad. So it might be worth keeping an eye on the Georgian wine industry.
All right.
And probably the most interesting day, which doesn't necessarily mean the best day, was when I went to the cave city of Voronya from Batumi. It was really the reason I went to Batumi, although it would be a nice place to go in good weather because it's in the mountains with a stream running through the middle of town. I think it'd be quite picturesque if it hadn't been cold and grey and raining. But anyway, I went up there so I could go to the cave city of Voronya, which is way down in the south, almost on the border. And I arranged a car and driver through my hotel. And it's a 2-hour drive. So we set off in the rain, and about 15 minutes into the drive, we're up in the mountains. It's really pretty remote. There's not much traffic on the road. And there's this boulder-strewn hillside that we're going past. And one of the boulders decides to break loose and comes down the mountain towards us. And fortunately it missed. But, this isn't the best omen for the trip. So we get about an hour and a half into the trip, and the cars coming towards us, and the driver starts looking at the cars coming towards us and saying snake. And I'm thinking, snake? And then it dawns on me, snake must be Georgian for snow. Because it's snowing. And this is September, right? I mean, it's the end of September, but it's not supposed to snow up there till December. So fortunately we get to Vardsia, and it's not actually snowing at Vardsia, but it's really cold. And I could really use gloves because lots of steps up and down. And I don't spend as much time there as I had expected to because I'm a little nervous about some of the steps. So then we start back, and we start for
Before
lunch.
you start back here for a second, explain a little bit about what the cave city is that you're talking about. I'm looking at a picture right now, but I'm not sure that everybody else is.
Okay. Well, Vardsia, I forget exactly what period it's from. I think it's from the Queen Tamar period, which would be 1200s. And it was basically carved out of the side of the mountain. Churches, their houses, and apparently people lived there. I have to say I was not as impressed with Vardsia as I expected to be. But that's partly, I think, because I didn't explore as much of it as I might have done. But there was not as much in the way of carving of frescoes as I expected.
Okay.
But I have been spoilt by going to Ellora and Ajanta in India. If you hadn't done that, I think it might be a little more impressive. But the setting is great. I mean, it's remote, it's up in the mountains. I'm sure when the clouds aren't down, the view is great.
Okay, and then you started to say you were heading back.
Yeah, we were heading back and we stopped for lunch. I'm about finished when my driver gets a call on his phone and disappears. So I finish eating, I pay the bill, I go down. The car has moved, and I see that the car is jacked up because we have a flat tire. Gets the tire fixed, and we start off home. And then we almost run down this guy standing in the middle of the road who must be deaf because he doesn't get out of the way. So it was like this was just kind of a whole litany of what can go wrong with this trip.
And as long as we're talking about things that can go wrong, what warning would you give for somebody going to Georgia?
Take a flashlight.
Because the electricity.
The electricity and the streets and the street lights, or absence thereof.
All right.
Yeah, I definitely needed a flashlight. Take a sense of humor, I mean, which you always need.
That's on my regular packing list.
Yeah, actually the food was pretty good. So you're not going to have problems with food. You're not going to have problems with drink. You don't need to take a whole lot of money. The ATMs worked for me. I only used my credit card twice. So definitely plan to use the ATMs.
Okay.
And go planning to hike, I would say. Plan to get off the roads and get some exercise.
And then you were just hiking on your own. You weren't doing a trekking tour or something like that.
No, and in fact, I wound up not really hiking because of the medical problem, because I didn't get up to Kesbergi. I think there is one group that is doing a trekking tour, maybe Exodus.
Okay.
That's not at all difficult to arrange a car and driver, and I'm sure it's not difficult to arrange a guide either.
Okay.
And there is information in Lonely Planet on some of the hikes you could do. And there is now the beginning of a network of tourist information centers. I think the one in Batumi was the only one that actually had any maps in stock.
Okay.
But they also had somebody who spoke English and who could give you information and who seemed eager to give you information. People were generally very welcoming, even though I don't speak Russian or Georgian. I didn't really have a language problem. The oldest people, I think, typically speak Georgian and Russian, but they would rustle up somebody younger who spoke English if necessary.
Okay.
And the same thing in the restaurants. If it was not a bilingual menu, there would usually be somebody around who could speak enough English that you could, like, order salad and chicken. And shashlik, I mean, is easy. And, I mean, the absolute cheapest but great tasting thing to eat is called khachapuri, and that's cheese pie, which is actually a lot better than it sounds. You can get khachapuri just about everywhere for practically nothing, like maybe one lari, which is maybe 50, 60 cents.
Huh.
And if you like dumplings, the other thing that you can find everywhere is kinkali, which is dumplings. I don't happen to like dumplings, so I didn't eat them, but you see them everywhere.
Okay.
And then lots of shashlik, which doesn't actually show up on a skewer. It usually shows up on some kind of hot plate sizzling.
Okay.
And cucumber and tomato salad with a really nice spicy sauce on it. So that's pretty much, I mean, what you're going to find in the local restaurants. And then if you're in Tibilisi, I mean, there's some more Western restaurants. Although I did eat at the Courtyard by Marriott one time, and I really can't recommend it. It was very pedestrian and very expensive. And they charged my credit card in dollars instead of lari, which is really annoying.
Okay. And you talked about talking with people. Who was the most memorable person you met?
Oh, I forgot that you might ask me that. Actually, probably my ophthalmologist.
Oh, so this was a Georgian ophthalmologist.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I doubt there would be another kind.
I didn't realize whether this was your ophthalmologist at home or whether you'd had the eye trouble when you got to the country.
Oh, well, kind of both. I had seen my ophthalmologist shortly before I left because I had been getting floaters, and he diagnosed posterior vitreous detachment, which is very common once you reach a certain age. He told me, go ahead with the trip, but 2% of the time this leads to retinal detachment, which is really serious, which needs treating within a week. So the floaters went away. I go off on the trip, and then I'm getting ready to leave Kutash for Tibilisi, and I get a whole new set of floaters, rather different from the first set. So I get to Tibilisi, and I look this stuff up on the internet, and everything I read says you should get this checked out. So I took a look at the U.S. Embassy website, and they listed an English-speaking ophthalmologist in Tibilisi. So I went to see her, and that was a little entertaining. I get there bright and early Monday morning, right, and it turns out that reception doesn't open till 9:30, and the doctor doesn't get there till 11. So I go off and do a little wandering around and have coffee, and I come back. And I pay my 60 lari, which is what it cost, which is, I know, about $30, I think. And I get exactly the same eye exam I got at home. And she says the retina looks fine. And we both heave a deep sigh of relief. But she says, but you have a burst blood vessel. We talk about this, and she finds out I'm planning to go up to Kazbegi, and she says, well, I think your blood is too thick, and you probably shouldn't do that. And we do a blood test. So we did a fasting blood test the next day, and I went off to the wine district, which I had been going to do after Kazbegi. And then I came back to Tibilisi, and she said, yes, she thought my blood was too thick, and I shouldn't go up to Kazbegi.
Huh.
So then I went to see my ophthalmologist when I got back, and he thinks that the burst blood vessel was just the last vestiges of the vitreous detachment that caused that, and maybe I didn't really have to worry about it too much. But she was very concerned about me, and she made several phone calls to get in touch with me, and I was really impressed with the care she took. I was also impressed by the nurse who did the blood test, because I usually have a lot of trouble with blood tests because my veins are very narrow. And this was the best blood test I have had in years. It didn't hurt, and it didn't leave a bruise. And I got to lie back in this big leather chair while they did it.
So yet another reason to go to Georgia.
Yes, I mean, I can say that the medical care, if you have an eye problem, seemed to be pretty good and cheap.
Excellent. As we go to wind this down, you really know you're in Georgia when what?
Okay, you really know you're in Georgia when you see a cruciform church with a central tower perched up somewhere inaccessible.
All right. And if you had to summarize Georgia in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Well, clearly mountains.
Okay.
And clearly cheap. It's a great budget destination. And I would say welcoming.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with us your love of Georgia. And where can people read about your travels?
Okay, my blog is at mytimetotravel.wordpress.com.
Excellent. Kathy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Chris.
I have one internet resource for you today, and that's a site called roomatlas.com. It's a Google Maps mashup. That is Google Maps with some additional functionality. In this case, the functionality is that when you zoom in on an area, you can see different flags for different hotels where the color indicates the number of stars the hotel has, and the price is written right on the flag, and therefore you can very easily get an idea where to stay or how much it's going to cost. roomatlas.com. In news from the community, by the time you hear this, the brochure for the Egypt Photography Tour, the Amateur Traveler and Ralph Velasco tour that we're doing in November 5th, will be up on the site, up on amateurtraveler.com. If you can't find it, also check out a link in the show notes, and you can also go to amateurtraveler.com/tours to find a list of all current tours that are planned. I got an email this week from our friend Eric, who has been trying to visit all the national parks in the U.S., that after listening to the episodes on Israel, he has decided to put that on hold and go to Israel this year. And I'm curious, this brings up a question for me. Who else has made travel plans based on what they've heard in the Amateur Traveler? I would love to hear either an email or leave a comment on this episode where you have gone because you heard about it here in the Amateur Traveler. And I heard from Reed, who said, I have recently started listening to your podcast and love it. I enjoy travel, but I don't get to do it as often as I would like. You and me both, Reed. Meaning I do not get to do it every day of the year. Your podcast lets me travel vicariously through the experiences of others. It is a surprisingly short trip from listening to one of your podcasts to researching visa requirements in Kyrgyzstan or flights between Auckland and Nui. I hope that I can join one of your meetups next time you're in the New York area. And I should remind people that I will be in New York at the end of June for the TBEX, TBEX, the Travel Blog Exchange Conference. So if you're going to be in the New York area about the third week in June, let me know. And I do want to do another meetup, and so hopefully, Reed, we'll get together as well as others. I forgot to point out earlier that it's ironic that we were talking about Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, today, with the news that probably had some people looking at their map to find that country after the tragic death of the luger recently at the Olympics. I do want to remind people that the Amateur Traveler is part of the Travelcast network at travelcast.com. If you're looking for some other good travel podcasts, check that out. With that, I think we'll wrap up this show. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode. Follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. Join the Facebook group, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. And remember, when you put your hand on the mouse next time, what are you going to do? You're going to go to amateurtraveler.com/vote and vote to send me to Costa Rica. At least I hope you will. As always, thanks so much for listening.